There was a point in the banquet hall where the chandeliers stopped being fixtures and became constellations. Cold, precise lights hung above people who had learned to read power like a map. Lena Harris felt them like weather. They refracted across the polished tableware, sent small constellations skittering over the hammered silver of her ring. And for a wild instant she let herself believe that someone might finally read her as part of that map instead of a smudge on its edge. She had worn the dress as an argument, dark, unobtrusive, a borrowed piece that left only her hands to speak. Under the sleeve, the ring was a secret she carried against her skin. It was nothing like the smooth, monogrammed signet rings at the head table. The hammer marks made the band irregular under the light. The blue stone sat off-center, as if the jewel had been coaxed into place by hands that were impatient with perfection. When she had first found it in the bottom of a tin box in the little house she shared with Alfred, she thought it was only a charm. Later, it felt like a key she could not yet name. They were gathered for the Chiron Inauguration, an event that had eaten years of rumor and patience, and had been choreographed down to the breath between applause and speech. The family's emblem, a rising horse encircled by a laurel and a tower, had its own place in the choreography, a crest that meant succession, patronage, doors opening in an invisible order. Lena had been invited in the same way a stray leaf is invited into a cathedral, her presence acknowledged but never expected to alter anything. She came because her name had been written on a gilded card, and because Alfred had pressed a shoulder against the door and told her to be there. Michael Jones moved through the room as someone who had rehearsed being magnanimous. He had been part of Lena's life once in a way that made this night heavier. The label attached to him was ex-son-in-law, but the hours they had shared when she still lived in cramped apartments and made deliveries at dawn were a small map that either of them ever bothered to unfold in public. He smiled the way a man sells comfort to a crowd. He had the crest in his hand when he reached the lectern, and the crest was a small, cold thing cast in silver, its sigil cut with the same careful arrogance as anything else in the room. The moment was set. Michael told a story about roots and risk, about families who lent their name like a lighthouse to good companies and worse. He prefaced the handing over of the crest with that practiced cadence of social theater, the pause that turns explanation into verdict. Lena felt it in her chest, a tightening as old as the first time a manager had laughed and called her one of those girls. She imagined, absurdly and briefly, that he would lift the crest and slow his eyes to find her. She imagined him making the right kind of mistake, acknowledging her claim by mistake, by grace, by accident.
Instead, he lifted the crest and turned, and the light seemed to tilt toward Vivian Lane. The applause was a manufactured rush. Vivian accepted with a smile like a photograph. She was the kind of confident social climber the city favored, polished, unruffled, with the exact unthreatening ambition of someone who would never learn to feel small. As the crest touched her gloved hand, a ripple moved through the room like a cold wind. A reporter's camera caught the tilt of Lena's chin. Somebody murmured, "Of course." The murmurs had the scent of inevitability. Michael's voice was soft when he said the words that made Lena feel like a thing whose name had been misplaced, announcing that the crest, by vote and by tradition, went to Vivian, a woman whose family had given precisely the kind of capital that the Charons liked to keep visible. One of the brothers, Lucas, nodded as if the motion had been part of an agreed-upon choreography. Another, Logan, made a sympathetic face. Leon, the youngest, kept his hands folded and his eyes on his plate. The three looked like pillars in a room of glass. Their faces were not cruel, merely practiced. Lena found her breath where she had kept it hidden and let it out small. The table a few rows forward filled the silence with a hollow laughter, companionable, efficient. She felt her jaw working, an instinct to speak, to clarify, to ask that ancestry be checked by the only evidence she had, the ring. The ring that Alfred had said came from his mother's mother. He heard the syllables, a Chiron thing, like a secret she hadn't been permitted to hold. Instead, she sat with her hands on her lap and the ring a warm stone. The room put a lid on her, chandeliers, cameras, expectation. Everyone's attention learned to forget leaves. The map remained an ordered chart, and she was not plotted on it. Then, in the space between one photograph and the next, a small performative hush was coaxed from the crowd. Someone high up at the dais announced a tradition, a short, formal test that the Charons used to adjudicate contested claims in ceremonial settings. It was the sort of family custom that lived on rumor and on archives. It was ornamental but not harmless. The moderator called for the crest to be verified before the assembly by 3 measures: a surface inspection by UV light for the crest's hidden filigree, a biometric pressure check, an old family kiosk that measures the resonance of the crest against a living signature, and, if the first 2 were ambiguous, a discrete swab for genetic linkage to a registered sample in the family ledger. There was a kind of silence that followed, one that tasted like a courtroom. Lena's mouth went dry. The ring on her hand felt suddenly conspicuous. The blue stone gleamed as if it had been carved by a slow, remembering tide. She was not one to court attention, but she had come hoping that attention might be redirected, not as a spectacle, but as a correction.
She had not expected to be the thing corrected. "Do you wish to present your claim, Miss Harris?" Michael asked, his voice a polite tilt. The question landed and became a pressure. Lena glanced at Alfred, who had come with her and now stood behind her like an old, softened wall. He was frail in one way and immovable in another. In his hand he held a small envelope, frayed at the edges, with a postmark from a neighborhood she had never been to, and a tiny seal of wax she couldn't read from where she sat. He gave her a look that asked her to do whatever she thought best. She rose because the space between being seen and not being seen had collapsed. The room watched as if it were watching how a commoner would bow to the performance of justice. Lena stepped toward the lectern. The UV lamp hummed when it was produced. Its light found patterns on the crest that ordinary eyes couldn't. Technician hands, professional, gloved, moved with the ritual diligence of people who had practiced grace. The crest lay under the lamp. The filigree showed faint, a map of engravings that the lamp coaxed into view like constellations. When the crest's light lay across the band of Lena's ring as she offered it, an almost ceremonial touch to assert claim, the blue stone blinked. A low murmur filled the room that could have been hope or calculation. Someone leaned forward to read the tiny marks. The biometric kiosk made a soft, approving tone, and then registered ambiguity. "Ambiguous," said the moderator, which in the language of the room sounded like verdict. Whispers folded into whispers, cameras angled. Lena felt the room narrowing to the size of a throat. The third test was proposed, the discreet swab to be run against the Chiron ledger's recorded samples, an old card kept in the family's archive, a paper breadcrumb that could unlace a story. Someone else would handle the swab. Someone else would take the sample. The assembly insisted on witnesses. The family insisted on procedure. Lena's hand went to the ring. For a single private moment she touched the blue stone with a fingertip and remembered the house where she had slept with the sounds of trucks filtering through the walls, where Alfred kept a pot of tea and a stack of letters with edges browned like old bread. The letters had names that didn't mean anything to her yet. Matteo, a man who had written about ports and accounts, and a grandmother who had kept her money in a way that made no parade. Lena had not thought of legacy as a thing that could be claimed. She had thought of it as gossip. Now it seemed like a blue stone and a knot. She allowed anxiety to sit in her chest, and then folded it into a steadying breath. The ceremony that followed was clinical and public. A technician produced a sterile swab. Camera operators pivoted as if by choreography. Officers from security, Captain Louise among them, pressed their attention to the chain of movement.
The swab was taken from the ring's inner lip, where the skin had polished the metal. It was placed by gloved hands into a labeled sealed tube. A witness, Geller, the family's archival gatekeeper, with his thin, watchful face, signed a ledger. Michael watched with the serene cruelty of someone who had arranged a lesson. Vivienne unfolded a smile that did not touch the eyes. It was meant to be a minor bureaucratic thing. Another box ticked on a form the family trusted because the form had always been their arbiter. Yet the room buzzed like an overwired device. Cameras clicked. A journalist in the front row scribbled hard. If the swab matched the registry, Lena could be recognized in some formal capacity, an ally at a board, a steward of funds that could, if properly handled, be steered toward people she had once known in small neighborhoods. If it failed, the spectacle would bury her. The sealed tube was placed into a pale envelope and handed to a young man in a dark suit, Kevin, who had until tonight been an inconspicuous presence hauling documents and carrying trays. Kevin's role was that of a courier. He accepted the envelope and stepped toward the secure crate where the family's temporary evidence would be kept before it was transferred to the archive. The crate was a small thing, locked and marked, and it would be watched until a formal chain of custody was established. At that precise moment, someone clinked a glass, and a joke landed like a stone, remade into ripples. Lena heard the laugh and the sharp intake of breath from a table behind her. She watched Kevin take the envelope and seal it in the crate. The crate was slid under a table that served as a staging area. The technician, efficient, flanked by 2 security officers, locked it. The small ceremony around the crate had the theatrical calm of people willing themselves to be neutral. When the crate closed, something in Lena tightened. The room returned to its music, a string set where the notes sounded like measured felicities. The crest had been presented, the ritual was nearly complete. Someone near the dais began to speak about future philanthropy, about investments, about the seamlessness of family continuity. The applause that followed was automatic. The cameras panned, the photographers leaned back, and for a sliver of a second Lena felt unmoored, a boat whose anchor had not settled. Then a hand on her shoulder, Alfred's, released a folded piece of paper into her palm. She opened it as a private emergency. The paper was Matteo's handwriting on an envelope, stamped and creased. There was a brief note inside, a sentence scrawled like a map. If ever the blue finds Boyce, look in C12. Lena had no idea what C12 might be, but she kept the paper and folded it into the pocket of the dress like contraband. That would have been the flicker where, in another story, the world tilted and everything rearranged in a neat revelation. Instead, the night spun onward.
The assembly made smaller choices.
Desserts, speeches, a few toasts. Lena sat down and let the room's noise move around her like weather. She tried to be still and not a spectacle in its own right. She might have left with nothing but indignity and a small sorrow, if not for a mistake someone made with a hand that wasn't careful enough. 2 hours later, when the small crate was recovered from the staging table and brought before the Chiron brothers and their emissary for the first formal record of custody, a discrepancy showed like a stain on paper. The label on the sealed envelope had been reaffixed with a variation of handwriting. The technician swore it had been sealed in his presence. The ledger was checked and the signature said one thing. Another slip of paper inside the crate had the wrong stamp. Someone at the dais, a woman with a face like a clean coin, Geller, tilted his head and said, "There appears to be a breach." The room compensated for the breach in the only language it knew, with performance. The Chiron brothers clustered together, voices low and urgent, like men who had been schooled in taking storms and making them look like weather. Lucas ordered a temporary hold. Logan insisted on a witness. Leon, quieter than a stone, asked for the CCTV from the staging area. Michael's smile tightened like a wire. Lena watched the way faces changed when papers were in doubt. There was something in the air, an odor like the passing of a verdict. People leaned forward to watch, because uncertainty is a form of entertainment for crowds trained to measure the world by who loses. Lena felt suddenly aware of how fragile the demonstration of power could be. A misplaced envelope, a handshake, a clerk's handwriting, and the whole machine paused. A secret door that you think is welded shut can sometimes be opened by someone who does not care if a lock is bent. "Open the crate," Lucas said. Security opened it and took out the envelope. Someone cut the seal. Inside was the swab tube, still labeled with the ring's imprint. But the inner packaging, the secondary seal that the tech insisted had been intact before Kevin carried it, was torn in a way that suggested someone had reached in and touched the tube before it had been formally locked. The room leaned in, collectively, and the phrase chain of custody moved from legal abstraction to the sound of a bell. Kevin's face went pale in the lights. He said, "I put it there myself, sir," too quickly. The sentence had been practiced by someone who had already imagined accusations. He had the small flinch of a man used to moving things and not being seen. A technician checked the envelope stamps, and an anomaly showed up on the security monitor, a glitching frame that suggested a shadow had slipped across the camera at the exact time the crate sat unattended. "Show me the footage," Logan said. They replayed the short clip in a corner of the room.
The camera, grainy and cramped with the hall's noise, showed the staging table as a plate of light. A gloved hand appeared from the edge of the frame. It reached into the crate with deliberate, practiced motion. The hand was quick. The glove had a small nick on the thumb. The hand closed around the swab tube as if it had been waiting for it. Then the hand withdrew and vanished from the frame. People around Lena did what people do when confronted with evidence inside a room designed for appearances. They turned it into narrative. Geller's mouth was small with trouble. Michael's jaw tightened. Vivian's face had gone a polite white. Lena felt the room narrow until it was only the footage and the sound of a clock in some other place that she could almost hear. Her legs were solid. She was not going to faint. She recognized the rhythm of someone who knew their rights when affronted, and she found herself folding that recognition into something like resolve. Captain Louise stepped forward, her face a map of duty. "We need to trace that glove," she said. "We need to check the guard rotation and the timing logs. We'll want the raw feed from every camera that points that way. We can't declare anything until we know what the camera missed." Her voice was procedural and clean. The words had weight because they promised process. Lena watched as all the rococo of the evening, the speeches, the toasts, the icons, shrunk into a file, into footage, into something that could be checked by people with white coats or sober faces. The chink in the armor was a breach that someone could follow. Somebody in the room, a woman from the press with a pen like a talon, had the temerity to ask the question that had been running beneath everything. Who had motive? There were smiles and murmurs and deflections. Motive in that room is not an abstract. It is a geometry of stakes. Michael had motive in the social order he sought to maintain. Vivian had motive to solidify her ascent. Kevin had motive to keep the supply chain smooth because his job depended on it. But motive is a slippery currency. It could mean anything. Alfred's hand was warm when he touched Lena's elbow. He had watched the footage too from the cramped corner where he had sat. He did not speak loud, but when he did, his voice was a dry reed. "There's always a hand in the dark," he said. "They think the dark hides them." Lena thought of her grandmother, thin-lipped, steady, who had kept ledgers and made notes in the margins of receipt books until they looked like maps. She had never told Lena about money the way you tell someone about a garden. When Lena had asked what the old coins in the tin meant, her grandmother had said nothing, only folded another corner of a letter and sealed it. She had a way of waiting. The CCTV replayed, slowed. The gloved thumb's nick repeated, and in the room, hundreds of eyes ran like combs across hands, cuffs, lapels, searching for a match.
Nobody yet saw the problem as anything other than a breach. In the back, a young man in a suit, whose name Lena would learn later, Jason Reed, stood with his hands in his pockets, looking as if he had too much logic to be part of the pageant. He did not attempt to make a speech. He did not look away from the screen. "Good," Lucas said. "We will not allow any transfer or registration until the forensics are complete. Freeze the account. No signatures, no change in status. Notify the legal department and place an embargo." The words were a soft net, a temporary safety for something that could otherwise be stolen by narrative. That was the moment Lena heard a small electric thing inside her, a sense that the story could be turned into something other than spectacle. A verification could become a defense. A ledger could become a law. The room would not be kind to an outsider, but it feared uncertainty more than it feared outsiders. Michael's face hardened into a careful neutrality that flattered no one. He made an almost invisible motion with his hand toward Vivian, the kind of protective gesture that keeps alliances tidy. Vivian gave him a look of gratitude that tasted like currency. Someone in the crowd clapped in encouragement, others did not. And yet, under the surface, the night reshaped itself. The cameras would be combed down to the frame. Kevin would be questioned. Someone would examine the glove and find where it had been bought. Perhaps they would find the nick matched a ring or a tool. Perhaps they would not. The line between vindication and spectacle was thin and slick as the silver on Lena's finger. For the first time since she had entered the hall, Lena felt a small, dangerous optimism. Not the naive kind, but a plan forming like a stone's shadow. If a crate could be breached, then a ledger could be opened. If an envelope could be switched, then a paper could be found. The blue stone in her ring felt like an accusation and a claim. She folded her fingers under the table and held herself still. Someone near the stage whispered a name, Kevin, and the sound slid toward the door like wind. Faces pivoted. Jason Reed moved before anyone else could, crossing to the security desk with the surf of a man who had no time for ceremonies. He asked plainly for the raw footage, the guard logs, the satellite feeds if there were any, anything that would give the sequence of events teeth. Captain Louise complied, her hands quick and certain. "Place everything in sealed envelopes," she said. "2 copies, one for an independent lab, one for the family archive. No one touches the originals." The sound of her instruction made the room behave like a machine. Men in dark suits left to pull files. Geller, with a face like a thin folded map, made notes that were not for public consumption. Michael's smile was a knife folded into silk. Vivian held her crest to her chest as if it had become fragile.
When Lena stepped outside into the night, the city felt indifferent and vast. The banquet's cold lights dimmed behind the window. Alfred leaned on his cane and breathed fog into the air like an old god. "You're not finished," he said, as if making a fact known rather than offering comfort. "They weren't meant to do that to you in public. These people like the theater, but the theater has ropes." Lena folded her arms and pressed her palm against the blue stone. For the first time she wondered what the object had meant before she had been in the room, where it had come from, and why her grandmother had kept it hidden enough that it lived in the bottom of a tin. If the ring could be linked to a ledger, then something larger could be true, that a woman who had been quietly saving and sending letters and folding margins into maps had been setting traps of her own. "What do we do next?" she asked Alfred. He looked at her as if the question had finally been voiced. "We hold them to process," he said. "We watch the cages. We don't jump. We don't yell. We make them do what they're afraid to do. Be honest in the light." But the light had not yet shown everything. Back inside, in a small, unremarkable room with a bank of monitors, someone played the footage again. The camera's grain showed the glove reaching in. Between frames, a flash, a profile, the slant of a collar, a rehabilitation of posture that felt like a signature. Lena leaned forward as if proximity could lend certainty. In the light, a movement at the edge of the feed, a hand with a cufflink flicking against a wrist caught the corner of her eye. The cufflink cast small motif, a tower with a horse in its base. It was the Chiron emblem, but not the family issue kind. It was worn and scratched, the sort of thing a man with connections and history would wear because it referred to belonging without needing to explain it aloud. She watched the frame over and over, as if repetition made truth harder to deny. The silhouette's shoulder carried a familiar line, someone who had been at too many dinners, an arm that had learned how to stand when the world applauded.
She felt something in her chest tighten again. The footage did not name the hand, it only suggested it had been deliberate. Outside, the night air had a chill that tasted like consequence. Lena pressed a palm to the glass of the building's lobby and left a small smudge. She could not know then that the smudge would be a marker, that it would align with an old ledger entry and a sealed envelope and a woman who had kept accounts hidden as if they were prayers. She could not know that what began as a public humiliation would in the coming days thread into a revelation that would unsettle the balance of a family and turn a ring into a symbol with legal teeth. She could only know with a clarity that surprised her that she would not be the only thing looked at in pity. She would be watched for strategy.
She would be measured for the kind of person she might choose to be, vindictive or responsible, a lightning strike or a steward of things with care. And she would, in the days to come, have to decide which measure of power she would accept. If you want to follow the way this evening bends into the investigation, if you want to see who will step forward to help, who will step back, and which documents will finally be pried loose, subscribe and see where Lena's claim takes her. They sealed the footage files in duplicate and called for outside counsel. The Chiron brothers convened in a glassed room that smelled like coffee and strategy. Kevin sat in a nearby office, hands folded too still, while a security officer took his statements. Michael retreated to a private anteroom his movement had made for him. Vivian arranged her scarf as if smoothing an image. Lena rode the elevator down with Alfred beside her. The city outside was a map of small lights. She had always thought herself better at doing than at being done to. The humiliation had been public. The repair would be private, procedural, and slow. She had a ring and a note and a frail man who had the memory of names. That was not nothing. Back inside, while cameras were boxed and envelopes were sealed, someone, Jason, made a call. His voice was flat when he told the person on the other end to place a hold on any transfers involving Chiron assets until forensic verification was completed. It was a small, bureaucratic sovereignty, and it mattered. "Don't let them move anything," he said, "not until we have independent verification." His instruction landed in the same way Captain Louise's had earlier, an appeal to process. Process protects, and process delays the violent neatness of a story that would have made Lena vanish into the margins. In the pause between the immediate and the eventual, the room chose procedure, and procedure, for now, was an ally. But procedure is only as strong as the people who enforce it. In a small evidence room, a sequenced series of files had a line missing. A guard's log showed a 10-minute window where the camera's angle shifted to accommodate a maintenance crew. Somebody's hand, gloved and quick, had stepped into a frame and altered the course of the evening. In the static where a story's proof lives, there is always room for a human hand. Later that week, Lena would stand in front of a bank of faces and begin to choose allies and opponents. She would learn the taste of compromise and the arithmetic of mercy. She would read ledgers until her eyes burned and walk into rooms that used to be close to her with the wary pride of someone wearing new armor. But the story that night was still an open wound, and whoever had thought to reach into the crate with a glove hand had no idea they had stirred something larger than a scandal. They had only, with a practiced touch, forced a chain reaction that would not stop at humiliation. The crate's breach was a pebble. It would make concentric circles. As Lena walked home under street lamps that did not pretend to be constellations, she folded the Matteo note into the palm of her hand and felt the blue stone bite at her skin. The ring was a small, stubborn thing of metal and story. In the quiet, she told herself that she would learn what it meant to hold it. She did not know yet whether holding would bring revenge or repair. She knew only that she would not let the night be its only definition. Inside the hotel's security suite, the footage was reviewed again. The gloved hand's cufflink, a tower and a horse, gleamed in the corner frame like a punctuation. Someone typed a name into a search bar, and a string of results came back. Invitations, receipts, a blurred photograph of a man in conversation with Michael Jones at a fundraiser 3 years prior. The photograph was not proof, only a trace. But traces can be followed. In the weeks to follow, that follow would take them to places Lena had not imagined. Vaults where ledgers slept under wax, letters in Matteo's careful hand, a safety deposit box with a name shouted by an old woman no one had thought to notice. For now, though, the evening had given Lena something she had not expected. Not just humiliation, but a fissure. When people leave cracks in their own ceremonies, something will always find its way into those cracks. Lena closed her eyes and remembered her grandmother watering the single plant that survived storms. The woman did not speak of investment or claim. She kept receipts and margins, kept a ring in a tin, kept a note that said, "If ever the blue finds voice, look in C12."
The handwriting had been small and impatient, as if written while waiting for a bus. Lena pressed her thumb to the folded corner and turned home. A hand in the dark had taken one step. The light of the chandeliers had only dimmed for the moment. The rest of the city continued as if nothing had happened. But Lena Harris, humiliated, steady, and modestly furious, felt the first plan sketching itself in the margins of her life. She did not know who would stand with her, whose hands she could trust, or whether the ledger would open with kindness. She only knew that the ring sat warm against her skin like a promise that needed keeping. That was the beginning. The week that followed unspooled with a patience that felt intentional, like a room waiting for a verdict rather than a storm. Lena moved through it as if trying on gloves, careful, testing the seams. The morning after the banquet, she returned to the Chiron offices not as a supplicant but as a claimant. The building's glass reflected a city that had not decided yet whether it would be scandalized or bored. Inside, taped envelopes, sealed containers, and rows of monitors had replaced christening flowers. Procedure filled the air like a smell. Jason Reed had been the first to turn irritation into action.
He arrived at dawn with a lawyer on his phone and an irritation that read like a plan. Captain Louise established a custody log and a rota for evidence transfer. She moved with the measured speed of someone who knows the difference between haste and security. Geller hovered around archival boxes with the same scrupulous distrust he applied to all things written. The Chiron brothers met in a glassed conference room that morning and spoke in tones that treated the breach like a practical problem. Close the loop, find the hand, determine motive. For Lena, the work was less about patting herself on the back than about making sure the world could not pretend the night had been theater gone right. She was quiet, observant, and precise, each question she asked a lever. Who touched the crate? Who had access to the staging area during the 10-minute window? Who approved the guard rotation? She learned the names of technicians and the rhythm of the security feeds. She learned also the economy of favors in the Chiron orbit, small kindnesses that accrued like interest, and the thin, hard favors that cost reputations. At Jason's suggestion and at Lena's insistence, 2 independent laboratories were contacted. One was a family of forensic chemists with a reputation for industry neutrality. The other, a certified municipal lab that had handled probate disputes. Both agreed to receive sealed material under strict chain of custody protocols. Captain Louise oversaw the physical transfer. 2 copies of every tape, 2 sets of manifests, 1 route to each lab, the originals never to be opened on site. It was the kind of redundancy organizations love because it prevents narrative theft. Jason kept his calm like a made thing. His voice became the instrument of the hold he had placed on Chiron assets. Freeze all transfers, he repeated, and the lawyers wrote it down as if the repetition were a prayer. He filed emergency notices with the bank and attached formal embargoes to the ledger entries. The practicalities of sequestration felt like armor. Meanwhile, the security footage was replayed again and again. The same frames were examined from every possible angle until the grain of the image felt like a texture Lena could touch. The gloved hand that had slipped into the crate became an image she returned to when she could not sleep. Sometimes she could convince herself that it had been an accident, someone careless who had not meant harm. Other times she saw deliberateness in the angle of the wrist, the way the hand paused as if a practiced motion had prepared it. The cufflink in the narrow frame, tower above a rearing horse, kept returning like an accusation. Captain Louise led the technical probe on the security angle. She pulled guard logs and maintenance schedules, matched timestamps and light meters, and found that a maintenance crew had been authorized to pass near the stage at the precise time the crate sat unattended. One of the names on the crew list was Kevin's. Another was a contractor with a card that returned to a shell company. Lena watched Louise's face while she read the lists. There was no flourish in the way the captain spoke. There was a steady catalog of facts. "We have a window," Louise said. "We have a set of hands who had access. We have a camera with an intermittent shadow. We need to look at payment records and phone logs." It was in those records that Jason found an uncomfortable threat. Small payments, routed through a cleaning firm, ended up in an account associated with Kevin. The sums were not enormous, but they were precise and repeated. When Lena asked Kevin about the envelopes in the crate, he did not fold immediately. He had the trait of people who move paperwork on cue. That trait had always been part of his job description, to be seen and not heard, to ferry things between rooms. Faced with the surveillance stills and the discovery of receipts, his defensiveness cracked. They did not take him alone. Captain Louise kept the questions procedural. Jason sat with the legal pads. The room was deliberately unromantic. Kevin's voice, when he spoke, sounded like someone learning the thickness of truth as it falls. He admitted he had taken the envelope from the crate and resealed it, but his admission came with a line of small, plausible denials and an appeal. "I was told to make sure nothing got knocked over. I wasn't told to tamper, I was told to smooth it." He said he had been approached, days earlier, by a man who had given him a folded note and 30 pounds in cash. The man had not shown a face, only a cuff. The cuff with a small nick. At Jason's request, Captain Louise ran a check on Kevin's phone. There was a brief metadata signature of a call to a number traced to a fixer who had done favors for Michael in the past. The call logs did not prove conspiracy. They were a pattern, though, threads that loomed when enough of them were tied together. Kevin's hands trembled when he explained that he had been under duress. Avenge a debt, smooth an error. He refused to say the name aloud at first. Then, after a long hour with quiet pressure, he said, "I did it for money, for an order, for a name I didn't know, but the messages had Michael's schedule in them." Corroboration arrived when the independent analysis of the security footage identified the cufflink as one of 2 models sold to a concierge supplier who serviced members of the Chiron social circle. The same model, scratched in a way that matched the grain in the footage, had been seen in a blurred fundraising photograph from 3 years before, taken near Michael. The link was circumstantial but sharper than gossip. Public narrative feeds on certainty, but investigators feed on accumulation. The accumulation suggested leverage. Leverage suggested motive. But raw suspicion could not establish lineage. It could at best rewind the night to show who had tried to make Lena invisible.
For the question of heritage, the ledger, the ring, the reason why a hammered silver band might bind Lena to the Chiron story, more sure things were required. That is where Geller, quietly and inexorably, proved his worth. Geller had the look of a man for whom physical paper was a cathedral. He treated ledger folios like relics. He had the authority to request access to decades of registrar entries, and the diplomatic tact to extract the right white-gloved archivist to meet him in the vault. He did not move with theater, he moved with habit, the way a locksmith knows where the loose brick in a wall hides. He argued, not without the kind of gentle insistence that can only be wielded by someone with knowledge of who owes whom favor, for a trip to the municipal safety deposit vault that the Chiron family had used for generations. The transaction was awkwardly formal. The vault had an old clerk whose memory ran on the institutional clock of stamps and signatures. Geller produced a chain of letters, an old ledger reference, and the annotation of a chest labeled C12. Lena watched as the clerk read the name. A maternal surname, long since quiet in chancery, matched the neat script in the Chiron book. Geller's fingers did something small and almost indecorous. He ran his thumb along the edge of a ledger until a page slipped free, and there, in the margin, was a notation that matched the wax seal stamped into a certificate languishing in a leather box from 1959. The certificate itself was a kind of formal beauty, type, wax, signatories, and a hand that slanted like a geography. It declared that a small silver ring, hammered and set with a blue stone, had been entered into the Chiron registry under a name that matched a woman Lena's grandmother had once called Rosalind. The certificate carried an archivist's stamp, a notary's flourish, and a pressed fold where it had been sealed into existence. The ring's image was sketched in ink beside the ledger entry, the same off-center blue stone, the same hammer marks. The paper smelled like someone else's care. Geller did not wave it in the air like a discovery. He put it on the table and let the paper do its own work. He called in a conservator who tracked the ink with a loupe and found that the signature matched other registry signatures. He matched the wax seal to an embossing the family had not used in public for decades. The evidence had the quiet, relentless quality of things that have been kept because someone wanted them to be found someday. It did not declare Lena heir, it declared pedigree. But documents without an anchor in people can be debated. The ledger gave the ring provenance. The ring gave Lena a physical claim. To translate that into recognition, the old forensic standard had to be met: biological linkage, archival authenticity, and legal validation. This is where Mateo entered the stage like a slow mailboat arriving in a fog. He was not young, nor entirely well.
He had been mentioned by Lena's grandmother in the past as a man who once kept accounts at the docks, who had written letters with the steadiness of someone who had time to wait. Alfred had kept a correspondence with him, a folded string of envelopes that had lived in the same tin as the ring. Mateo's hand had a clear, patient script. When Mateo arrived at the small flat where Lena and Alfred sorted their days, he brought a satchel and a box of old paper sealed with a rusting clip. He recognized Lena immediately. Time had thinned her edges but had not altered the way her face held a quiet responsibility. He handed her a satchel of letters that smelled like salted paper, and that contained among them a faded bank receipt and a small key labeled with the number C12. "You told me to hold on," he said. "She told me to hold on too. I kept your grandmother's letters because she always said paper remembers." The key matched the vault entry. Geller, who had expected nothing less, orchestrated the retrieval with exactness. The safety deposit chest yielded a set of papers that read like a truth the family had never expected to be asked to stand behind in public. A
a small notary certificate that tied the ring to Rosalind Chiron, a marginal note in Mateo's handwriting confirming a transfer of small funds, a sealed envelope labeled with a date, and the faint smear of an old blood card. It was the blood card that made the scientific part possible. In an era when records were kept on thin cards, families sometimes kept reference samples taken during medical visits. The card in the chest was enveloped in the same waxed paper that had preserved the certificate. It bore a dried smear and a small note. Rosalind, reference card, 1958. The card was accompanied by an attestation from a municipal clinic, an official stamp, and a pen stroke that matched other clinic samples archived in the ledger. For the independent lab, this was gold and also risk. The card was old, its preservation could be challenged, its substance degraded. The labs took the samples with conservative language and protocol, double-sealed transfers, multiple witnesses, independent chain of custody logs, and a candid note about degradation risk. The technicians spoke as if praying to probability. They called Lena in and explained, in the clean language of numbers and chance, what could be done. A comparative analysis between the reference smear on the preserved card and Lena's recently secured swab. The tests, they warned, would not proclaim destiny. They would provide a statistical support for relationship. Lena watched them work as if watching someone unpack a map. The technicians put the old card under a light, selected fragments that still contained genetic material, and performed extraction with a caution that honored both science and the fragility of aged matter.
The laboratory's report, when it arrived 3 days later, used the language of likelihood, a high probability consistent with a first-degree relation to Rosalind Chiron. The phrasing did not say certainty. It did not need to. The numbers were the kind of evidence courts used when combined with documents and chain of custody proofs. That combination, archival certificate, ledger entry, and probabilistic biological support, was what eventually made a case hard to wave away. It was not an avalanche of absolute proof, and it did not have to be. It had what institutions respect: traceable documents, corroborating physical objects, and independent verification. Word of the lab's finding traveled through the building like a measured ignition. Jason prepared motions that cited the lab's limitations and the strength of the corroboration. He framed arguments for provisional recognition, not a handing over of crowns, but a formal inclusion on interim stewardship, coupled with an immediate, binding audit of any intended transfers of Chiron-associated funds. The Chiron brothers were not uniform in their reaction. Lucas, the eldest, in demeanor if not age, had the look of someone whose politics were tempered by practicality. He read the lab report and then read it again, lips thinning into the consideration of someone who must choose a posture for public consumption. Logan swore softly into the marble of his hand and admitted privately to the discomfort of reputational risk. Leon listened and then asked pointed, methodical questions about liability and fiduciary duty. Public recognition required choreography. The family could have ducked into private arbitration, but the breach had been public, and the ledger was a record that retailed to more than the family: investors, patrons, and the press. The thing that had begun as performance would have to end with performance, an announcement, a form of adjudication that the community would accept. Jason insisted on a press conference and a formal vote by the board, a motion to recognize Lena as a registered descendant with provisional stewardship, pending full judicial review. Before the vote, the board convened in a room that smelled of coffee and old leather. There were legal briefs and sworn declarations. Kevin, after hours of interviews and a handful of signed statements, agreed to provide testimony that matched the transaction trail. He admitted to the physical movement of the envelope and to the nudging pressure of others. In exchange for cooperation, Jason negotiated that Kevin would receive a lesser charge and be required to testify, publicly and under oath. The bargain stirred discomfort in some quarters, but Lena understood that trade-offs were the freight of progress. She wanted the truth more than she wanted retribution. When the board convened, Geller produced the ledger page. The steno clerk read the lab's conclusion aloud, framed not as absolute certainty, but as a statistically likely relation supported by archival association. The motion passed with a measure of reluctance and a chorus of admonitions. The recognition was provisional, conditioned on continued verification and legal formalities. But a motion had passed. The crest would have to be retitled, at least for the time being, with Lena named as a registered descendant with temporary stewardship rights and a required place on the oversight committee. The press conference that followed was theatrical in its own right. Microphones clustered like migratory birds, cameras hunched, and the question of how the city would frame a woman who had been humiliated being named a steward of Chiron's philanthropic arm was the implicit headline. Lena stood at the podium opposite the brothers. The crest had been removed from Vivian's hand and placed, neutral, anonymous, on a low table. The brothers read carefully prepared statements. They spoke of family duty, of the need for process, and of respect for evidence. Lucas, whose voice could carry the weight of tradition, said, "We acknowledge the documentation and the independent analysis submitted.
Out of respect for both the Chiron estate and for the person who has come forward, we will grant provisional recognition and representation pending judicial resolution. Michael sat to one side of the dais, the expression on his face a blend of composure and barely veiled irritation. He had not been accused in court. The evidence suggested he had motives and associates, and his denials were precise. He made them with the practiced calm of someone who was hoping to retain a measure of dignity in public. Vivian said nothing. She looked as if she had rehearsed being unshaken and had succeeded. When Lena spoke, she did not speak in claim, but in intention. Her voice was measured, the kind that could carry across rooms without pleading. "I am not here to take a crown," she said. "I am here because history has a habit of being kept in small places, drawers, tins, letters, and sometimes those places are held by people whose names do not make page one. If I am recognized by this family and by the institutions that oversee them, then my obligation is to make sure that recognition translates into stewardship that protects the people who live under the shadow of Chiron patronage." Her words were basic in the way that law is basic, clear, actionable. She named 3 initiatives she would pursue if given the authority: immediate audit of any pending transfers to private entities with potential conflicts, an emergency fund ring-fenced for employees and small contractors at the company who might be vulnerable to sudden layoffs, and a standing oversight committee that included independent community trustees.
The room listened because she had not asked for revenge. She had asked for channels and systems to prevent a repeat of the old theatrical politics. The brothers agreed to the motion with compunction and caution. They framed their concession as respect for process rather than capitulation. The press printed the statements as headlines that married scandal and restraint. Chiron provisional recognition granted. Ring, ledger, and lab bring new air to light. Banquet breach leads to audit. The story had a tidy arc that feed rooms liked. A breach, followed by investigation, followed by accountability. Not everyone was satisfied. There were recriminations, private conversations that hardened into alliances, and a string of dinners where reputations were repaired with careful wine. Michael moved as if struck by a loss that was less than total and more than a bruise. He had wielded the banquet like theater, and now watched as the theater's props were requisitioned for evidence. Lena recognized something like grief in his posture, and something like defeat. She did not exult. She kept her celebration small. The aftermath work was granular and unglamorous. Lena took to the records room as if it were a second home. She read contracts and trustee agreements until the hours were late, and Alfred fell asleep at the counter with the light on. She insisted on transparency, invoices, statement reconciliations, and the names of shell companies that stood between Chiron funds and alleged beneficiaries. She demanded that the audit be public and that an independent firm be contracted to trace beneficiary chains for 5 fiscal years. She appointed, with awkward ceremony, a mixed oversight body, some Chiron representatives, trusted community members, and legally backed trustees. Her choices were practical and intentionally unglamorous. She could have thrown Michael into public disgrace or demanded removal of the older brothers from the board. She chose instead systems that would make it harder for future theatricals to close a transaction in the dark. In a clear nod to institutional memory, she secured retroactive checks on any transfers the family had made in the prior year, particularly those that affected unionized labor and small suppliers. There were moments when the moral arithmetic pressed at her. Friends and allies whispered for more decisive measures. The cameras wanted a villain to be strung up publicly, and there were pundits who delighted in the prospect. Lena signed restraint with the same hand she used to sign audit orders. Kevin's cooperation would yield him a lesser charge, but Lena insisted on restitution. He would make public testimony, but he would also work in a reparative program for the warehouse teams his negligence had endangered. She felt the gravity of mercy, how it could be weaponized or become a bridge, and she chose to tether it to accountability. Alfred, who had been small and steadfast through the ordeal, had his own quiet vindication.
The letters he had kept, and the patience he had shown in keeping them, were validated in a way he had not sought. He would not be asked to take plaudits. He preferred to heat his soup in the kitchen at night, and Lena let him. He had a way of smiling that registered like pride that had been earned quietly. There were personal moments, too. Lena found herself sitting one evening in the archive with Matteo, listening to him recount small details about her grandmother, the way Rosalind liked tea at the hour the tide turned, the small habits in the ledger that read like weather. Matteo spoke like a man with a garden of memories. He admitted he had kept the papers because Rosalind had once told him, "If the blue ever spoke, let someone hear it who will do something with the money." He had not meant it to become public. He had meant it as a final instruction. Lena listened and felt the whisper of responsibility settle. In the quiet, she thought of Rosalind not as a specter, but as a woman who had made small plans for a world she would not see. But power attracts attention, and the night would not close its hand quietly. In the weeks after the public recognition, Lena began to receive notes in envelopes like the ones Rosalind had written, small, unsigned, an old photograph tucked within. In one, a figure stood in the distance, a silhouette too deliberately placed to be an accident. In another, a phone number that traced to a private investigator who had once worked with Michael. These were not threats, they were reminders that visibility invites reach. Michael's presence in Lena's life did not vanish. He showed up at hearings and sat in the back of legal rooms, a man whose posture had been altered by loss. Once, on a day when the auditors were nearing the end of a 6-week sweep, she crossed paths with him outside the courthouse. He approached with the flinch of someone attempting repair. "Lena," he said, with the sort of smallness that had not been possible in the banquet's glare. He paused, as if clodding the apology. "I didn't mean for it to go like that." She could have answered with the sharper thing her friends asked for, a cold dismissal, a scene. Instead, she asked a question she had rehearsed privately. "Did you give the order?" He did not answer directly. He said, "I made choices that night I cannot undo." He left the admission like a coin on the table, a token but not a confession. Lena kept her silence. She had learned the economy of testimony. Words could be weaponized. She had what she needed for public governance. She did not need a private victory. In the shelter of office hours and long nights, Lena began to build the structural changes she had promised. She reordered patronage and philanthropic disbursements into 3 tracks: emergency relief, workforce protection, and community redevelopment. She prioritized transparency reports and built an anonymous hotline for employees worried about coercion.
She appointed Captain Louise to a security oversight role and asked Jason to draft a new code of conduct for all contractors and vendors that required independent verification of source funds. She also made choices that were political in the moderate sense. Lena reached out to Vivian with an invitation to a mediated meeting. Vivian accepted, wary and composed. It was a gesture that surprised some. An ally who would have expected a cutting remark instead found Lena willing to speak in a tone that matched her public promise. At the meeting, Vivian slipped into the recognition of the warding nature of their new conversation. "I don't want to be the enemy," she said. "I don't think in this room enemies solve anything." They agreed on a guarded partnership. Vivian's social capital could be directed to a fund Lena insisted be jointly monitored. Lena's public posture was deliberately mild. She took the press at times, explained the carefulness of audits, and spoke of healing and responsibility. Her choice was tactical and moral at once. She knew retribution would be a spectacle that risked more cruelty than change. She had watched what spectacle could do to someone like her. Instead, she built structures and numbers and lists, papers that might outlast a headline. People like her grandmother planned by margins and contingencies, not by statements. Yet there were consequences to wielding authority with restraint. Some allies wanted more force. When certain vendors found their contracts under review, they complained, and the complaint lines led to meetings in which unpleasant truths about procurement patterns were aired. Enemies of change framed the audits as vendettas. Lena's decisions were questioned in earnest and in malice. Her days became a ledger of small triumphs and procedural battles, but with each signed order, each sealed audit report, the machinery of fairness tightened ever so slightly. Yet the shadow lingered. Weeks after the recognition, a photographer in a local paper caught a picture of Michael at a private diner, sitting opposite a man whose silhouette matched that of the blurred frame from the banquet footage. The two men leaned toward each other with the conspiratorial posture of people used to arranging favors. The photo was grainy but telling. It circulated like a whispered rumor augmented by a visual. Lena saw it and felt only for a second the old sting, but she did not return to the banquet's hysteria. She had an office now, and a mandate that required strategy, not fury. In private, she made a set of lists. One was a ledger of allies: Jason, Captain Louise, Mateo, Alfred, Geller's quiet competence. Another was a list of tasks: audits, hotline setup, a community council, and independent trustee appointment. She scrawled a third, darker list: questions that remained. Who had sent the man with the cufflink? Who had leaned on Kevin? Which hands had incentive to keep donations opaque? She kept the lists because lists reduced anxiety to work, and work was what she had learned to do. Alfred, who had watched her with a small, sometimes disbelieving pride, took to sitting in the office once a week. He would bring soup, and they would eat together as Lena read through contracts or met with auditors. One evening, as rain tracked the window, Alfred put a knotted hand on Lena's arm. "You look like Rosalind sometimes," he said. "Not in the way you look, daughter. In the way you don't get surprised too much." Lena laughed, not unkindly. "She planned," Alfred said. "Not for glory, for safety." That was the name she wore now, safety. Lena had no appetite for theatrics. Her rise was a measured one, rooted in documents and probability, and, crucially, in the willingness to put her authority towards systems. She did not seek to flaunt the crest. She sought to keep people from falling through the mechanisms that had once let her be humiliated in public. But stewardship has its paradoxes. The more visible Lena became, the more useful she was to those who wanted to co-opt her moral stance.
Invitations arrived to speak at functions, to appear in photographs, to lend a veneer of progress to projects that were sometimes more performative than substantive. She declined or insisted on concrete terms. She learned the currency of refusal. Months after the initial breach, the investigation reached a public denouement that satisfied procedure. Kevin pled guilty to the chain of custody tampering and testified to the phone calls and the envelope trades. The independent lab's analysis, the ledger certificate, and the safety deposit chest paperwork were accepted as part of a formal record that would stand up in appellate motion if needed. In the press, the story moved from scandal to governance. Chiron reforms, new leadership at philanthropic arm. The headline did not fix everything, but it changed the grid through which people might live in the shadow of Chiron patronage. Lena was granted a seat on the board with a mandate to oversee philanthropic disbursement policies. She accepted, but not as a coronation. On the day she signed the paperwork that gave her the legal authority to veto certain transfers, she did so in an office smelling of paper and tea and the faint ply of old wood. She felt the weight of the ink. The crest that had been waved like a toy at the banquet no longer had the capacity to define her. Her first act in office was modest and calculated, a directive to set up a workers' emergency fund and an immediate review of contractors. Her second was the institution of an anonymous reporting line and the appointment of 2 community trustees to the Oversight Committee. The third was a call to Geller asking him to lead a task force on long-term transparency. Her decisions were not purely altruistic, they were tactical. She had learned that structural change is slower but more durable than spectacle.
She preferred to trap error with policy rather than with headlines. Where possible, she used mercy as leverage. Kevin's reduced sentence included community service, supporting the warehouse teams he had endangered. Michael was barred from certain voting rights for the duration of the review, but retained the ability to appeal. Vivian retained her social position, but agreed to the oversight terms. These choices were not without cost. Friends accused her of being too conciliatory. Strangers admired her for a guarded grace. The press, which thrives on easy arcs, sometimes hunched forward when she chose patience. Through it all, Lena kept to a rhythm she found by returning to the ring at night, turning it under soft lamplight as if it were a compass. The blue stone would catch the light and throw it back, small and defiant. There were moments that confirmed the new balance. A contractor who had previously tried to pull strings met the audit and found his contracts canceled. A supplier who had been mistreated received compensation. An assembly worker at the Chiron Operations Center, an old woman Lena had met in the first month as steward, came to the Oversight Committee with questions and found doors that had once been closed opened. Those were the days when the ledger felt less like a weapon and more like a tool. And yet, as the public record assembled and the Chiron institution leaned toward policy and audits, a new photograph arrived in Lena's inbox one late afternoon. It showed a diner from the inside. In the foreground, Michael laughed as he spoke to a figure whose shoulders looked like the shoulders of a man Lena had never seen, but whose posture carried power. The man turned their head in a way that suggested recognition. His profile was obscured by shadow. Someone had taken the picture from across the street. It was grainy, but it arrived with the caption that had accompanied many of the notes she got in the weeks since the banquet, a reminder. Lena pinned the photograph to a board she kept behind her desk, alongside the lists. The image was a small puzzle, a piece she would keep watching. There were always hands at work that could unsettle careful balances. Donors who had been used to leaked privileges, contractors who had a taste for old ways, men who preferred decisions by theater rather than by ledger. She understood, with the clarity that comes from living once at the edge, that recognition creates enemies, even as it builds defenses. In those days, she began to draft a longer strategy, a trust fund with legal guardrails, a public-facing transparency portal, and a series of civil society partnerships that could provide outside oversight. She convened a council that included people who had never been invited, union representatives, local nonprofit leaders, a former municipal auditor, and Matteo, who had become her unlikely but invaluable counsel on memory and ledger.
Geller smiled when he learned Matteo had a seat. He respected the past and people who cared for paper. Her final formal act that season was not rhetorical. She drafted, with Jason and the lawyers, a memorandum that codified what she had learned. Small things usually create the conditions for big wrongs. She insisted that no crest could be used as title until all chain of custody checks were complete, and until independent verification had been returned. It was a small rule, but it changed the ritualization of power the Chirons had relied upon. On the night the motion was signed and sealed, Lena left the office later than the others. Alfred, who had come to sit with the cleanup of an old life, walked her to the elevator. They did not speak much. He had the sort of face that looked like it had been carved with a small, steady tool.
When he reached into his coat, he handed Lena an envelope. Inside was a photograph of Rosalind, young, with a look of wry patience, and a short line in Mateo's handwriting. She would have wanted it done with quiet, like a ledger, not a speech. Lena folded the photograph into her pocket and slid the ring onto the same finger she had worn in the banquet. The metal felt like decision. As she walked home through streets that no longer felt only like a map of exclusion, Lena felt the possibility of being watched. She had become an object of interest to the same systems that had once left her invisible. In a cafe window, she saw her reflection and the reflection of the city layered over one another. The ring flashed. She considered vengeance sometimes, its immediate pleasure, the scalding justice of it, and then reminded herself of the ledger. A ledger cannot be undone with a headline. It can only be transcribed onward into something more equitable. She had new enemies she did not yet know how to name, and new allies who had already shown themselves. The final scene of the week arrived like a small, inevitable note, an anonymous envelope addressed to her office. Inside, a single photograph, grainy and low light, showed Michael with a hand on the shoulder of a tall man whose face was deliberately out of frame. On the back, in a handwriting that might have been a warning or a taunt, someone had written, "He is not alone." Lena looked at the picture and at the ring. The choice before her was no longer whether to accept the crest or not. It was what to do with the authority she had been provisionally granted. Would she use it to punish or to protect? Would she make the family's power a theater or a shield? She wrote the answer like a promise in her notebook, and then placed the photograph in a file labeled "Waiting." The months ahead would not be tidy. There would be appeals, slow legal processes, shaky reconciliations, and the constant work of defending the gains she had made.
But Lena had learned something the night the cradle had been breached. The map of power is less a monolith than a web of small openings, and the work of holding power responsibly is patient and granular. She chose, with a certainty that felt like an agreement rather than a blaze, to steward rather than to devastate. She would press audits, widen transparency, fund immediate protections for workers, and keep the oversight channels open. She would not pretend to be above the messy compromises public good often requires. She would also keep the lists, names of allies, patterns of suspicion, a watchboard that reminded her to look for the silhouette that came too often into frame. On a rainy morning, months later, as Lena walked into a small community center where she was to attend a town hall meeting about a fund she had arranged, she felt a hand on her elbow. It was Mateo, who had come because he wanted to see the people who would be helped by the fund. He smiled as if this was the end of the long line he had held open for her. Alfred, waiting in the back with a thermos of tea, gave her a look that was nearly a blessing. Outside, in the street, a man, anonymous, well-dressed, lifted his camera and took another photograph. It might have been a casual shot. It might have been a note for someone who kept lists. Lena didn't know. She kept walking into the center, into a room full of faces that were not aristocrats, but neighbors. Later that day, when she closed the meeting and looked out at the group, a small woman who had been denied a contractor's payment, a young man who worked nights at a distribution center, a retired teacher, she felt the ring warm on her finger. It was not the promise of inheritance so much as the weight of duty. The story did not end with a vindictive gesture or with a dramatic fall from grace. It ended with a series of small, stubborn acts, an audit that caught a misdirected payment, an emergency fund that paid a month's rent for an outworker, a hotline call that stopped a contractor from being exploited. There were no fireworks, only people who slept a little easier because someone had arranged the system to catch them. Still, the photograph in her file, the one of Michael and the shadowed companion, kept a space open. Lena taped the image to the inside of a drawer and left it there not as a threat, but as a reminder. Power required vigilance. Stewardship required both generosity and a willingness to look for the hands that reached where they should not. She did not fall in love with the crest. She kept it neutral on the table, a symbol she would never use to make theater again. Instead, she kept ledgers, reports, and lists, and when the city called and the press asked for statements, she gave interviews that were plain and durable, as if made for long reading rather than a headline. As evening fell, Lena sat at her small desk and wrote a letter, not a public statement, but a note to those who had given their trust. She wrote of the ledger and of the way small things held evidence, and of the choices she had made. She thanked Mateo and Alfred, Geller and Captain Louise, Jason and the auditors. She thanked those who had found courage to tell the truth. She did not make grand promises to fix everything. She offered instead a plan and an invitation to watch how the money moved, to hold leaders to account, and to keep the ceremonies of power from eclipsing the reality of people's lives. Outside, the city lights blinked like the chandelier that had once been a constellation above her head. The crest had been used to perform exclusion. Lena had turned its unsteady authority into something that could be tracked, questioned, and, when necessary, restrained. There would be more fights, and some secrets would laugh in the dark. But she had a ring on her finger, a ledger in the vault, and a team who knew how to read both. The last frame settled on a small, deliberate image. Lena at her desk, the blue stone catching lamplight, the photograph of Michael and his companion folded into a file marked waiting, and a list of rules pinned above her calendar. In the margin of the page, in a handwriting that had become an oath, she wrote simply, "Protect first, be just, watch." If you want to follow what happens next, who else is on the lists, what the long-term audit uncovers, and whether Lena keeps to her promise, subscribe to follow the next chapter of her stewardship.